The emperor, who was trained in Greek from his early years, wrote his meditations in Greek. Greek was the language in which philosophy was taught, and it was a language that Marcus preferred to Latin for the purpose of withdrawing inwards, meditating, and clearing his mind. He might have preferred Greek for his meditations as a means of alienating himself from Latin rhetoric and things Roman. Most of the entries in the Meditations were probably written far from Rome, the centre of the universe, in regions where Latin was barely understood, and the Latin rhetoric, exemplified by Marcus's tutor, Fronto, meant nothing. We know very little about the dates of composition of the Meditations. Occasionally Marcus expresses his beliefs that the end of his life is near, and he twice states that an intelligent man who has lived to the age of 40 can fully comprehend the pattern and monotony of human life. This suggests that the Meditations were written after he became emperor at the age of 39. We know from the titles to books 2 and 3 that some of the entries were written in the northern campaigns of the early 170s on the frontiers of the Roman Empire. In the letter to Lucius Gellius, to whom he conveyed his records of Epictetus' lectures, Diatribae, the historian Arrian of Nicomedia made a distinction between his transcription of the lectures of Epictetus, at which he was present and which he preserved in something close to stenographic accuracy, and the compositions of other authors. Like the Roman Stoic, Ausonius Rufus, and like Socrates, Epictetus did not commit his philosophy to writing. The same cannot be said of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. The long series of admonitions, aphorisms, and reflections that now make up the 12 books of the Meditations were entered into a journal as the emperor made the time to set them down. They are so personal and inwardly directed, and at times incomprehensible, that it is difficult to imagine that he dictated them to his Greek secretary, Apollonius. An example of their dense privacy is the entry, "A black character, an effeminate, unbending character, the character of a brute or dumb animal, infantile, stupid, fraudulent, coarse, mercenary, despotic." We do not know who the emperor is describing. As they have come down to us, the Meditations are not a mere transcript of the entries from Marcus's journals. Like his own life, these entries show signs of careful composition, as they are redacted as his Meditations. The first book of the Meditations is unlike any of the 11 books that follow. It is the carefully considered statement of the emperor's last will and testament. It constitutes the final testimonial of his gratitude to those who had directed, influenced, and improved his life. The beginning of the Meditations is the fitting conclusion of Marcus's life, not as an emperor, but as a philosopher. He begins by recording his gratitude to his grandfather, Marcus Annius Velus, to his natural father of the same name, and to his mother, Domitia Lucilla. He concludes by expressing his gratitude to and admiration for his adopted father and uncle, Antoninus Pius, and finally his gratitude towards the gods. There are many signs of arrangement or composition in the 12 books of the Meditations, especially in the first and last books. But the impression given by the manuscripts and printed editions of the Meditations, now displayed in 12 books and divided into 488 chapters, some long, some of single sentence, is misleading. Chapters are better thought of as journal entries. Journal is an accurate term to describe books or entries written at break of day, or first thing in the morning. The pleasure of meditating on the Meditations resembles the challenge and austere pleasure of reading the epigrams and pronouncements that survive from the book of Heraclitus. There are 127 of these. The challenge of reading them is like the challenge and pleasure of reading the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. This can be expressed in the words E.M. Forster chose as the epigraph for his Howard's End. Only connect. Connecting was the project of the emperor. it is now the challenge of his ruler. Marcus the Emperor of the Meditations. In the private entries of his Meditations, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus does not conceal from himself the fact that he is the Roman emperor and one in a long line of emperors. His insistent demand for rational analysis and stripping his human and material environment down to its essentials reveals an essential part of his character. Scattered through his Meditations, we encounter reflections on his duty to serve, as a male, mature in years, a statesman, a Roman, a ruler. This service is subsumed under his more fundamental duty as a rational human being to benefit and tolerate, perhaps the more difficult task, his fellow human beings. He never reflects on the many difficult questions of policy that confronted him during his nearly 20 years as emperor. He never names any of the contemporaries who played important roles in his armies or administration. Nor does he allude to the serious threats posed by the revolt of his general, Avidius Cassius, in 175, whose head was brought to him as proof of his defeat. There is only the most oblique recognition of his campaigns on the northern frontiers begun in AD 169. Typical of his philosophical attitude towards his military career is the analogy, "A spider is proud to trap a fly." Men are proud of their own hunting. A hare, a sprat in the neck, boars, bears, Sarmatian prisoners. If you examine their motives, are they all not bandits? Another more trenchant analogy is set down in 834. If you have ever seen a severed hand or foot, or a head cut off and lying some way away from the rest of the body, analogous is what someone does to himself, as far as he can, when he will not accept his lot and severs himself from society, or does some unsocial act. As emperor, Marcus, soon to be recognized as Germanicus, witnessed the beheading of captive Germans. The two panels showing this punishment are the grimmest scenes on his column in Rome. What is most impressive about the emperor as philosopher are the analogies, or images, icons, his own brutal experience as imperator, or military commander, suggested to him. The emperor who bore this heavy weight of honorific titles was well aware of his predecessors, and of Julius Caesar, whose cognomen, Caesar, became the equivalent of emperor. Marcus Aurelius mentions most of the emperors from Augustus to Antoninus Pius, whom he admired more than any of his predecessors. But it was not from Rome or the military camp that he looked at the empire and the court of the emperor. It was from within the heights of his inner fortress. Marcus also reflects on his own role as emperor. A deep contempt for the recipients of his benefactions is tersely expressed in one of the epigrams he quotes, itself a quotation in Book 7. A king's lot, to do good and be damned. And yet the emperor cautions himself not to complain of life in the palace. It is no obstacle to his own virtue. He reminds himself of the dangers of his station by inventing a new Greek verb. Take care not to be Caesarified, or dyed in purple. As for the purple dye that distinguished his senatorial order, he reduces it to the hair of a sheep soaked in shellfish blood. In his meditations on the brevity and insignificance of human life, he often turns to the great men of the past. Once he looks back on the court of Augustus. Wife, daughter, grandsons, stepsons, sister, Agrippa, relatives, household, friends, doctors, diviners, an entire court dead. In a similar exercise, he imagines the contemporary equivalents of known but vanished figures of the past. When you see Severus, picture Crito or Xenophon, when you look at yourself, picture one of the Caesars. We do not know which of the 14 Caesars who had preceded him he would have chosen, but the one that comes immediately to mind is his adopted father, Antoninus Pius. As seen from this perspective, the imperial court appears as an absurd and repetitive pageant. The same scene, the same play, just a different cast. Of all the titles he had gained as emperor, those that meant most to him he lists as good, decent, truthful, in mind clear, cooperative, and independent. These titles do not match the four canonical virtues of Greek thought, to which we return, nor are they the virtues advertised by the Roman emperors. Only once does Marcus mention the city of Rome. In the entry that concludes his meditations, he begins, "Mortal man, you have lived as a citizen in this great city." The city of Marcus's meditations was his provident Stoic universe, not the city and empire he prudently ruled over for what was, in his view, a brief moment in time. The Stoic Emperor. The word Stoic has two meanings. It describes both a member of the school of philosophy Zeno founded in the painted Stoa, and the approach to the ancient agora of Athens, and a person who represses his emotions and desires, is indifferent to pleasure or pain, and is enduring. Marcus Aurelius was trained by Stoics in his early years. As a boy of 12, he adopted the Greek way of life, and wore a thick cloak and slept on the floor. For his Greek training, Marcus had Tandaces and Marcianus to thank. By Greek training, he means wearing a rough cloak and sleeping on the ground, something from which his mother had to dissuade him. This is philosophical training, not that of a university. His adopted father, Antoninus Pius, was a Stoic in this sense. Marcus Aurelius was both a Stoic and Stoic. He gained the title of philosopher after his death. But how could the reader of his meditations tell that he was a Stoic? Throughout its long history in the ancient world, Stoicism was recognized not by the title Stoic, or by a strict allegiance to one of the four principal schools of philosophy, but by a kind of toughness and austerity, not to say an inhuman coldness and indifference to what other humans valued most: family, wealth, reputation, power, and even health. What attracted Zeno of Citium from Cyprus to Athens in about 313 BC was not its reputation at the end of the 4th century as the home of Platonists and Aristotelians. It was the example of Socrates, who had been executed by Athens in 399 BC. When Zeno arrived in Athens, he made contact with Polemo, then head of Plato's academy, of whom it was said that he never altered the set expression of his face, and more importantly, with the cynic Crates of Thebes, who himself emulated Socrates. Crates' master, Diogenes of Sinope, the originator of the Cynic movement, was styled Socrates gone mad, Socrates Meinominos. Throughout the history of the Stoa, the emulation of Socrates generated the moral impetus to the way of thought and action distinctive of the Stoa. We find it in Epictetus, AD 55 to 133, and in Marcus Aurelius in the last century of its prominence. Socrates was held up as the Stoic ideal of the sage, Sophos. His unflinching commitment to the virtues subsumed under the word arete, courage, justice, prudent self-control, and practical intelligence, and an unusual kind of piety, provided a stimulus to a rigorous reflection on human nature, soul, impulses, passions, judgment and rationality, and the intelligible and thus the intelligent ordering of the world, cosmos, in which men live. Zeno's sense of the indissoluble connection between the order of the human microcosm with a provident and controlling macrocosm led him to divide and unite the scope of philosophical inquiry into the concentric spheres of physics, ethics, and logic. these divisions are united in a single enterprise. The Stoics themselves were not united on every matter of doctrine, but they were one in their conception of divine providence and a divinely established hierarchy. A great ladder that reached from the inanimate to the animate, from the animal to the human and rational, and finally, from the human to the supreme rationality of the divine. The human soul, too, exhibited like gradations. As does any animal, the human animal, as it develops, gains a sense of itself, oikaiosis, or, in the first sense of this term, proprioception. That is, a manifestation of its instinct for self-preservation. In time, this sense of the self extends to others, as it reaches beyond the herd instinct to an awareness that all human beings are kindred in their rationality. This rationality is the connection between what is divine within the individual human being and the divine fire without, that transforms this unique world of ours into a unified whole, in which everything has its appropriate role and fulfills its duty, and nothing happens by accident or is wasted. The relation between human rationality and the directing principle of reason is tight. As humans, we are presented with the raw data of sense impressions that come from objects without or from within our bodies, phantasiae and hormai. Some impressions are clear and distinct. They are capable of moving us to pursuit or avoidance, and they stir our passions in all of their variety. Our capacity to reason allows us to form judgments concerning these impressions, and either to assent to them or to reject them. In this process of constant evaluation, there is only one standard of good and evil: virtue and vice. One of the most important injunctions for a Stoic was to live in agreement with nature. The phrase "in agreement with" homologomenos is significant. By nature, the Stoics meant the highest form of human nature, reason, logos. By agreement, they meant a participation in and conformity with a higher principle of rationality. Falling beneath the high standard of the Stoic sage in the gradation of values are the objects most humans either value and embrace or shun and despise, the indifferents, adiaphora. But for some Stoics, these indifferents could be ranked, as the Stoics stepped down from the high pedestal of absolute and uncompromising virtue. Although health is not necessary to virtue, it is preferable to illness. It often seems that two of the Socratic paradoxes are given new life by the Stoics. The first of these paradoxes is that virtue is knowledge. The second is its corollary, that no human being errs willingly, that is, knowing. To know is to will. If the agent knows, there can be no weakness of will, the crazier. There is much on which the Stoics disagreed, or on which they placed differing values. But in the third generation of the school in Athens, Stoic doctrine began to take a fixed form in the writings of Chrysippus. It was said that if there were no Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoa. Following on the beginnings established by Zeno, 335 to 263 BC, and Cleanthes, circa 331 to 232 BC, his follower and successor as head of his school, Chrysippus, circa 280 to 207 BC, was credited with establishing an all-encompassing Stoic orthodoxy. That Zeno's follower, Aristarchus, embraced a strict conception of virtue and rejected the gradation of indifference as preferred or not preferred, does not mean that he created a schism in Stoic philosophy. Not every Stoic could commit to Zeno's theory that during regular intervals this world would be consumed by fire, the doctrine of ekpyrosis. Not every Stoic was as interested in language and the forms of propositional logic as was Chrysippus, and no Stoic wrote as many books as he did. The total of his books is given as 705. Indeed, to qualify as a Stoic, an adherent to the school did not have to write a single line of philosophy. Nor was Stoicism confined to Athens. Like Epicureanism, it moved west. This was true in the first phase of Stoic philosophy in Rome. In the late Republic, two powerful figures were known as Stoics. Cato of Utica, who committed suicide in 48 BC rather than yield to Caesar, and Brutus, the Tyrannicide, who committed suicide after the defeat of his army at Philippi in 42. Brutus is known to have written ethical treatises, but his wife Portia might have been the more devout Stoic. The Stoic tradition continues in Cicero, who was murdered by Mark Antony in late 43. Although he listed towards academic philosophy, Cicero espoused Stoic doctrines in his On the Nature of Gods. In Book 2, the spokesman for the Stoics is Bulbus. And in the moral guide he wrote for his son, Marcus, On Duties, which owes a great deal to the Stoic philosopher, Panatius. He also made Cato's spokesman for the conception of the highest good in his De Finibus, On Ends. Cicero's correspondent Posidonius of Apamea in Syria, circa 135 to 51 BC, was the greatest Stoic of his age, and one whose cosmological thought is most congenial to the outlook of the Meditations. Seneca of the Letters to Lucilius and the so-called Dialogues, Dialogi, and Lucan of the epic on the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, the Pharsalia, follow. They were both forced to commit suicide in 65 by Nero after he had discovered the conspiracy of Piso. Ausonius Rufus, Thrasea Paetus, Elvidius Priscus, and Dio of Prusa, whose cynicism combined with Stoicism, were later Stoics. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher. Marcus was recognized as a philosopher by his contemporaries and later generations, but his Meditations do not read like a work of philosophy. In them, he does not recognize the tripartite division of philosophical inquiry into physics, logic, and ethics, and logic is almost entirely absent from the Meditations as a subject of reflection. Because he addresses himself, Marcus does not feel compelled to set out arguments to confute, convince, or convert others. Rather, in addressing himself, he seeks to review and confirm his fundamental beliefs about providence, virtue, and duty. His response to his inner dialogues is not to prolong the conversation in quibbles or debate. His goal is not victory or debate with himself, but a reformed and confirmed attitude directing action. And action, or praxis, is one of the most important meanings of philosophia in Greek. Marcus is unmistakably a Stoic, yet he never proclaims his allegiance to Stoicism, nor does he depend on the authority of the founders of his school to support his convictions. As emperor, Marcus concerned himself with the four philosophical schools in Athens: the Academics, Peripatetics, Epicureans, and Stoics, and treated and funded them all on an equal footing. His philosophy was never sectarian. On one occasion, he even speaks of the Stoics as if he were not a Stoic himself. He invokes doctrines already established by Stoic philosophers and by Socrates, which he had long accepted as valid. Never does he appeal to the authority of another philosopher to support his fundamental beliefs. His beliefs, dogmata, are ready at hand to effect an inward therapy and to confront an emergency, like the ready instruments of the surgeon. Remarkably, when he does refer to philosophers, he names Plato, the founder of what was in his day the Academy, but not Zeno, who founded the Stoa when he moved from Cyprus to Athens in 313 BC, or Zeno's successor, Cleanthes, head of the school in Athens from 263 to 232 BC. He twice refers to Chrysippus, the Stoic who did most to develop and fix the essential doctrines of the school, but not for any philosophical doctrine. The philosopher he was taught to admire by Rusticus was Epictetus, a Greek slave who lived in exile from Rome and taught in the small town of Nicopolis in Epirus. Epictetus was a Stoic, but perhaps deeper down, he was a Socratic. It is clear that on occasion when Marcus refers to Socrates, his Socrates was Epictetus's Socrates. Another philosopher who influenced him decisively was Severus, who had the reputation of belonging to the school of Aristotle. We have met him as the contemporary counterpart to Crito or Xenophon. He is remembered gratefully by the emperor, who learned much from him. Love of family, love of truth, love of justice, to have come by his help to understand Thracia, Helvidius, Cato, Dio, Brutus, to have conceived the idea of a balanced constitution, a commonwealth based on equality and freedom of speech, and of a monarchy which values above all the liberty of the subject. It is remarkable that the young Marcus was brought to admire figures who were devoted to the Roman Republic, and who emerged as fierce opponents of Julius Caesar and the imperial order Marcus was destined to maintain. Cato and Brutus were both regarded by their contemporaries as philosophers, Cato a Stoic, and Brutus a philosopher attracted to the Academy of Antiochus of Ascalon. Thrasea-Paetus was the admirer of Cato, and when he was condemned by Nero in AD 66, he too committed suicide. Helvidius Priscus was his son-in-law. His opposition to the Emperor Vespasian brought about his exile and execution, perhaps in AD 75. Dio is not, I think, Dio of Syracuse, the associate of Plato, but Dio Chrysostom, the philosopher and orator who was exiled from Rome in the reign of Domitian, Emperor AD 81 to 96. One of the remarkable things about Marcus is his generosity as a philosopher. Unlike Lucretius at the end of the Republic, and unlike Marcus's contemporary, the Epicurean Diogenes of Onoanda, the mountaintop city in Lycia, the emperor did not engage in corrosive polemic with rival philosophical views of the world, although, as we shall see, he was well aware of the philosophical divide that separated Stoics and Epicureans. Of the philosophers with whom he displays a deep affinity, the first and foremost is the slave and exile Epictetus. Then there is Socrates, who stood out for the Stoics as their most ready example of the sage, sapiens, and who had already been assimilated into the philosophical personality of Epictetus, just as he would become assimilated in the Meditations into the personality of the emperor. And, surprisingly perhaps, there are many striking indications of the influence of Heraclitus, whom Marcus absorbed into his own Stoic view of the world, as had other Stoics before him. Always remember Heraclitus. The death of earth is the birth of water. The death of water is the birth of air. The death of air is fire, and back again. Remember too his image of the man who forgets his way home, his saying that men are at odds with their most constant companion, the reason which governs all things, that their everyday experience takes them by surprise, that we must not act or speak as if asleep, and sleep brings the illusion of speech and action, and that we should not be like children with their parents, simply accepting what we are told. Even Marcus's avowed tendency to assimilate and make a part of his character whatever fosters his rationality and self-control, we cannot be at all sure that he is reproducing the actual language of Heraclitus. But a number of things in the thought and art of Heraclitus appeal to him. Heraclitus's conception of a universal rationality embodied in the logos of the universe and the rationality of human beings, his awareness of a cyclical pattern discernible within change, the river of change that seems to carry everything before it, but is in fact a part of the orderly transformations of the universe, the unnatural estrangement of the individual from what all men share in common, and the aphoristic style that gave Heraclitus the nickname the Dark. At times Marcus could be dark himself. As was the Stoic Seneca before him, Marcus was generous to Epicurus, and he had so deeply absorbed Epicurus's heroic attitude towards death that he can quote one of his letters from memory, inaccurately to the letter, but faithfully to his message. Indeed, he owes a debt to Epicurus for his injunction to withdraw into himself. The philosophical generosity of Marcus Aurelius is exactly parallel to his tolerance and openness to his fellow men. Its explanation is to be discovered in his sense that all human beings share in a common rationality, and that this rationality establishes the human community he describes as the city of Zeus. This community is not divided into philosophical sects. Microcosm and macrocosm. Yet Marcus remains firmly a Stoic in one fundamental conviction. He occupied one side of the great philosophical divide of his age. He tersely expresses the alternatives facing him. Revisit the alternatives, providence or atoms, and the many indications that the universe is a kind of community. He returns to these alternative views time and time again. These alternatives pit the Epicureans against the Stoics, as well as the academic and peripatetic philosophers who were united in their commitment to teleology. Against the materialist view that this world and all other aggregates of matter are the Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher. Marcus was recognized as a philosopher by his contemporaries and later generations, but his meditations do not read like a work of philosophy. In them, he does not recognize the tripartite division of philosophical inquiry into physics, logic, and ethics, and logic is almost entirely absent from the meditations as a subject of reflection. Because he addresses himself, Marcus does not feel compelled to set out arguments to confute, convince, or convert others. Rather, in addressing himself, he seeks to review and confirm his fundamental beliefs about providence, virtue, and duty. His response to his inner dialogues is not to prolong the conversation in quibbles or debate. His goal is not victory in debate with himself, but a reformed and confirmed attitude directing action. And action, or praxis, is one of the most important meanings of philosophia in Greek. Marcus is unmistakably a Stoic, yet he never proclaims his allegiance to Stoicism, nor does he depend on the authority of the founders of his school to support his convictions. As emperor, Marcus concerned himself with the four philosophical schools in Athens: the academics, peripatetics, Epicureans, and Stoics, and treated and funded them all on an equal footing. His philosophy was never sectarian. On one occasion, he even speaks of the Stoics as if he were not a Stoic himself. He invokes doctrines already established by Stoic philosophers and by Socrates, which he had long accepted as valid. Never does he appeal to the authority of another philosopher to support his fundamental beliefs. His beliefs, dogmata, are ready at hand to effect an inward therapy and to confront an emergency, like the ready instruments of the surgeon. Remarkably, when he does refer to philosophers, he names Plato, the founder of what was in his day the Academy, but not Zeno, who founded the Stoa when he moved from Cyprus to Athens in 313 BC, or Zeno's successor, Cleanthes, head of the school in Athens from 263 to 232 BC. He twice refers to Chrysippus, the Stoic who did most to develop and fix the essential doctrines of the school, but not for any philosophical doctrine. The philosopher he was taught to admire by Rusticus was Epictetus, a Greek slave who lived in exile from Rome and taught in the small town of Nicopolis in Epirus. Epictetus was a Stoic, but perhaps deeper down, he was a Socratic. It is clear that on occasion when Marcus refers to Socrates, his Socrates was Epictetus's Socrates. Another philosopher who influenced him decisively was Severus, who who had the reputation of belonging to the school of Aristotle. We have met him as the contemporary counterpart to Crito or Xenophon. He is remembered gratefully by the emperor, who learned much from him. Love of family, love of truth, love of justice. To have come by his help to understand Thracia, Helvidius, Cato, Dio, Brutus. To have conceived the idea of a balanced constitution, a commonwealth based on equality and freedom of speech, and of a monarchy which values above all the liberty of the subject. It is remarkable that the young Marcus was brought to admire figures who were devoted to the Roman Republic, and who emerged as fierce opponents of Julius Caesar and the imperial order Marcus was destined to maintain. Cato and Brutus were both regarded by their contemporaries as philosophers, Cato a Stoic, and Brutus a philosopher attracted to the Academy of Antiochus of Ascalon. Thrasiopatus was the admirer of Cato, and when he was condemned by Nero in AD 66, he too committed suicide. Helvidius Priscus was his son-in-law. His opposition to the Emperor Vespasian brought about his exile and execution, perhaps in AD 75. Dio is not, I think, Dio of Syracuse, the associate of Plato, but Dio Chrysostom, the philosopher and orator, who was exiled from Rome in the reign of Domitian, Emperor AD 81 to 96. One of the remarkable things about Marcus is his generosity as a philosopher. Unlike Lucretius at the end of the Republic, and unlike Marcus's contemporary, the Epicurean Diogenes of Onoanda, the mountaintop city in Lycia, the emperor did not engage in corrosive polemic with rival philosophical views of the world, although, as we shall see, he was well aware of the philosophical divide that separated Stoics and Epicureans. Of the philosophers with whom he displays a deep affinity, the first and foremost is the slave and exile Epictetus. Then there is Socrates, who stood out for the Stoics as their most ready example of the sage, sapient, and who had already been assimilated into the philosophical personality of Epictetus, just as he would become assimilated in the Meditations into the personality of the emperor. And, surprisingly perhaps, there are many striking indications of the influence of Heraclitus, whom Marcus absorbed into his own Stoic view of the world, as had other Stoics before him. Always remember Heraclitus. The death of earth is the birth of water. The death of water is the birth of air. The death of air is fire, and back again. Remember too his image of the man who forgets his way home, his saying that men are at odds with their most constant companion, the reason which governs all things. That their everyday experience takes them by surprise, that we must not act or speak as if asleep, and sleep brings the illusion of speech and action, and that we should not be like children with their parents, simply accepting what we are told. Even Marcus's avowed tendency to assimilate and make a part of his character whatever fosters his rationality and self-control, we cannot be at all sure that he is reproducing the actual language of Heraclitus. But a number of things in the thought and art of Heraclitus appeal to him. Heraclitus's conception of a universal rationality embodied in the logos of the universe and the rationality of human beings, his awareness of a cyclical pattern discernible within change, the river of change that seems to carry everything before it, but is in fact a part of the orderly transformations of the universe, the unnatural estrangement of the individual from what all men share in common, and the aphoristic style that gave Heraclitus the nickname the Dark. At times Marcus can be dark himself. As was the Stoic Seneca before him, Marcus was generous to Epicurus, and he had so deeply absorbed Epicurus's heroic attitude towards death that he can quote one of his letters from memory, inaccurately to the letter, but faithfully to his message. Indeed, he owes a debt to Epicurus for his injunction to withdraw into himself. The philosophical generosity of Marcus Aurelius is exactly parallel to his tolerance and openness to his fellow men. Its explanation is to be discovered in his sense that all human beings share in a common rationality, and that this rationality establishes the human community he describes as the city of Zeus. This community is not divided into philosophical sects. Microcosm and macrocosm. Yet Marcus remains firmly a Stoic in one fundamental conviction. He occupied one side of the great philosophical divide of his age. He tersely expresses the alternatives facing him. Revisit the alternatives, providence or atoms, and the many indications that the universe is a kind of community. He returns to these alternative views time and time again. These alternatives pit the Epicureans against the Stoics, as well as the academic and peripatetic philosophers who were united in their commitment to teleology. Against the materialist view that this world and all other aggregates of matter are the product of an infinite number of atoms moving blindly in infinite space, the Stoics held a conviction that everything that happens in this universe, with its single inhabited world, is coherent, providential, and serves some purpose in nature's grand design. Either an ordered universe or a stew of mixed ingredients, yet still coherent order. Otherwise, how could a sort of private order subsist within you, if there is disorder in the whole? Stew, kukion, is a word we find in a philosopher whose thought and aphoristic style impressed Marcus deeply, and he seems to have appreciated the underlying implication of cosmological order in a saying of Heraclitus. Marcus adapts it to describe the cosmic stew produced by the transient and fortuitous combination of atoms. The word Stoics used to describe their unique world was the whole, holon, or the universe, cosmos. That is, the order implied by the word cosmos in Greek. By polemical contrast, the Epicurean Lucretius described this world as this heap of matter on the nature of things. Marcus's outer world was made up of four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. His human constitution was made up of earth, water, air, and fire, his soul of air, and his mind of fire. This fire, which can transform into its own element anything it encounters, is vividly evoked in the first entry of Book 4. It is both internal and external. The inner fire of the mind connects with the intelligent fire of the world that can design and has created a scale of being rising from the inanimate to the animate, and from animal impulse and instinct to human rationality. What is truly divine about a human being in the great scale of nature is what he sometimes likes to refer to as the very God, David, that is seated in you. Human rationality, or the controlling principle he refers to as the directing mind, to hegemonical, is a part of the directing mind of the cosmos that brings elements together and dissolves them again. At times, Marcus contemplates without commitment the possibility that the world will be consumed in this divine fire. The process of ekpyrosis. The other metaphor that reveals the connection between the individual and the universe of which he is a member is that of the city. This metaphor projects the ideal unity and organization of human cities onto the universe in which men are citizens of the city of Zeus. Zeus, or the Roman Jupiter, favored the pious emperor and Rome. One of the most providential events of his campaign against the Quadi and the Danube was Jupiter's answer to the Athenian prayer he refers to in Meditations. Reign, dear Zeus. It is depicted on his victory column and shows Jupiter, or the mysterious rain god, who, in answer to his prayer, is sending the torrential rains that overwhelmed the enemy forces. The city of Zeus makes its last appearance in the Meditations as Marcus takes leave of his journals and, it seems, his life. The city of Zeus is the expression of an optimism not always present in the Meditations. There are passages that come close to articulating the belief that all is for the best in this, the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire attempted to satirize this Stoic and Catholic optimism in his caustic poem on the Lisbon earthquake, 1756, and Candide, 1757. The Stoic ideal of the city is a construct that Lucretius and Diogenes of Inoanda were bent on demolishing by showing how improvident nature was in her provisions for human beings. Lucretius' condemnation of nature's providence, tanta stat praedita culpa, she stands convicted of so great a fault on the nature of things, was Voltaire's favourite phrase from Latin poetry. But, as we shall now witness, this apparent optimism can give way to a disgust of the world. Stripping down. For Marcus, philosophy was the therapy of the soul, and he practices a variety of therapies on his soul. In this sense, his meditations are his medications. One of these therapies is described by the technical term merismos. The word means breaking into parts or dissection. Parts, meri, and limbs, meli, are very much on Marcus's mind. Like Plato before him, Marcus is convinced that one of the projects of philosophy is to analyze the world of man and matter into its parts, and then to reach a conception of the whole of which they are parts, or members. At times, this exercise can have the effect of alienating us from things we value most as humans. We have already glimpsed it at work. How good is it when you have roast meat or such like foods before you, to impress on your mind that this is the dead body of a fish, this is the dead body of a bird or pig, and again, that the Falernian wine is the mere juice of grapes, and your purple-edged robe is simply the hair of a sheep soaked in shellfish blood, and in sexual intercourse, that it is no more than the friction of a membrane and a spurt of mucus ejected. In a similar entry, he exploits his conception that we can only live in, if not for, the present moment by analyzing the pleasure of watching a dance, by breaking it down into movements that become jerks as they are arrested, frame by frame, and music as it is frozen note by note. A string of such reflections can be threaded by the reader of the Meditations. As we come to Marcus's therapy for the frenzy of renown, we shall see how he attempts to make the Roman desire for eternal renown seem Lilliputian. There are other therapies in Marcus's repertoire of spiritual exercises that are not as difficult to accept as his radical dissecting and denuding of human experience. One is the analysis of experience into what is material and what is causal, a distinction that goes back to Aristotle's theory of fourfold causality stated most fully in Metaphysics A. By its concentration on causality and matter, and of the active and the passive, it is an analysis that encourages us to look into the mind and motivation of other active agents. The most important of the therapies of the Meditations is the project of withdrawing into the self, or, in our sense of the word, meditation. Seneca's words for this were, withdraw into yourself. Cecide inte ipsum. Letters to Lucilius. Marcus's first full expression of this comes in the entry 4.3. Men seek retreats for themselves, in the country, by the sea, in the hills, and you yourself are particularly prone to this yearning. But all this is quite unphilosophic, when it is open to you at any time you want, to retreat into yourself. No retreat offers someone more quiet and relaxation than that into his own mind, especially if he can dip into thoughts there which put him at immediate and complete ease. And by ease, I simply mean a well-ordered life. So constantly give yourself this retreat and renew yourself. The doctrines you will visit there should be few and fundamental, sufficient at one meeting to wash away all your pain and send you back free of resentment at what you must rejoin. This is, I think, the most impressive of all the entries of the Meditations. But it has many rivals. It opens to us the inner citadel into which Marcus retreated during his northern campaigns beyond the Danube, and it encourages us to find such a retreat within ourselves. The struggle for virtue. For Plato and the Greek philosophers who followed him, there were four cardinal virtues. We have noticed them in passing. They are prudent self-control, sophrosuna; practical intelligence, phronesis; courage, andreia; and justice, dikaiosune. Marcus embraced and exhibited all of these, but only once does he list these four virtues as a tetrad. The virtues to which he aspired were more numerous than these. He lists some of these in the address to his soul that opens Book 10. He wanted to be good, simple, individual, bare, brighter than the body that covers you, disposed to love and affection, free of need, missing nothing, desiring nothing. The virtue of honesty, truthfulness, and a courageous recognition of reality, altheia, combine into one of the most important of the virtues of the Meditations, integrity. These virtues connect with Marcus's deep sense of responsibility to and tolerance for his fellow human beings. Some of these and many another would strike the public who handled the coins proclaiming the manifold virtues of Marcus's rule as surpassing strange. Set against the public pronouncements of the virtues of Marcus's reign, ruled by divine providence, providentia deorum, and the blessings of generosity, liberalitas, fairness, equitas, integrity, fides, justice, justitia, safety and security, salus and securitas, are the virtues Marcus aspired to as a philosopher. These private virtues might have seemed as strange to the public through whose hands his coinage passed, as the virtues of Christ's Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:1-10, would have seemed foreign to Aristotle. Marcus represents attainment of these virtues as a contest, agon, like a wrestling or a boxing match. But his opponents are not external to him. In his conception of his inner soul, he recognized a struggle between reason and the raw images, phantasiae, appetites, passions, impulses, and ambitions of his other self. It was up to him and his directing mind to weigh them and to assent to them and pursue them, or to reject and avoid them. The desire for sleep, but not for sex, the temptations of anger, the attractions of repute and fame are all threatening rivals to his victory over himself. And in these meditations, the self gains an absolute autonomy, as Marcus asserts that all is as thinking makes it so, most forcefully in 12:8 and 12:26. That is, it is not the world of matter, or our bodies and their desires and pleasures, or their pains and griefs, or the opinion of others that control us. It is reason that by its careful judgment creates an autonomy of the rational self. The Stoics held up a paradigm or ideal of the philosopher in complete, autonomous, and godlike control of himself. This was the sage, sophos in Greek, sapiens in Latin. This sage makes no appearance in the journals of Marcus Aurelius. The closest we come to discovering him, and he is always a male, is in the 10th book of the Meditations, when the emperor contemplates the death of others, and obliquely his own death. No one is so fortunate as not to have standing round his deathbed some people who welcome the fate coming on him. Was he the earnest sage? Then maybe there will be someone at his final moment saying to himself, "We can breathe again now, rid of this schoolmaster. He was not hard on any one of us, but I could feel his silent criticism of us all. Marcus does not identify himself with the famous sage, but his words, "the earnest sage," are ironic, precisely because they represent the judgment of others. No man can pass such judgment on himself. Fame. There are two subjects of admonition that are recurrent in the Meditations: anger and the desire for fame. They connect inasmuch as both anger and fame surrender an individual's autonomy to the offense or judgment of others. Anger represents an involuntary spasm and a momentary lapse of reason. It severs the rational bond that unites all human beings. Fame, of course, should mean nothing to the philosopher who focuses his attention on the present. For Marcus, it is only the present moment distinct from the abyss of the past and the future that should concern us. The past and future lie beyond our control. But there is an unsettling contrast in Marcus's meditations between his concentration on the present moment, to akeriaion, and his larger conception of his life as a path on which his reason, the gods, and those who influenced him in early life directed him. It is also discordant with his frequent presentation of his life as a play scripted by Providence. His disdain for fame does not sit comfortably with his attachment to the past. All the actors in the play of history have, of course, disappeared. But in his meditations, Marcus constantly brings them back to the stage on which they had acted. They are mere names and legends, mythoi in Greek. All things fade and quickly turn to myth. Quickly, too, utter oblivion drowns them. But he keeps them alive. He even memorializes the names of slaves who would have remained unknown to us were it not for his mention of them. One of the exercises that served Marcus as an antidote against the frenzy for renown, both among one's fellows and in future generations, is to take a distant view of our small, inconsequential world. It is an exercise that we find in its most dramatic form in the conclusion of Cicero's Republic, written in 51 BC. Cicero has one of the speakers of this dialogue, Publius Cornelius Aemilianus Africanus, describe a dream in which his grandfather appeared to him. From the distant Milky Way, the great Africanus pointed his grandson to the tiny and spotted globe of the earth. From this vantage, the center stage of the world seems very small, and human fame a passing shadow, Republic Book 6. At times, Marcus exhorts himself to look down on human life from a height. At times he urges himself to look up at the stars or sun, and once he speaks of his kinship with the stars. Looking down, the earth appears as a mere point in space. The history of the preservation, publication, and fame of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations goes beyond the scope of this introduction, but something needs to be said of the fame the emperor despised. The fitting conclusion of any treatment of the Meditations can only be a repeated reading of the Meditations. One of his Greek readers, perhaps Simokatis Theophylactos, in the early 7th century, wrote as a codicil to the noble conclusion of Book 12 an 8-line poem that summarizes his reading of the book. In the Vatican Codex and also in the Palatine Anthology, 1523. If you want to gain control of pain, open up this blessed book and enter deep within it. Its wealth of philosophy will bring you to see with ease all the future, the present, and the past, and you will see that joy and distress have no more power than smoke. Smoke reflects one of the last entries of Book 12. Although Marcus's subjects bestowed on him the title philosopher, the emperor's fame as a philosopher hung on the survival of a set of meditations of which none of his subjects could have been aware. Julian the Apostate, emperor AD 361-3, records the emperor favorably in his satire, The Caesars. He might actually reflect the language of Meditations 10.1 in his description of Marcus, but he makes no mention of the Meditations. It was in a speech of the orator Themistius, Julian's contemporary, and fervent supporter in his doomed attempt to restore his empire to paganism, that we find the first clear reference to the Meditations. In an address of 364 to the Eastern Emperor Valens, Themistius speaks of them as Marcus's exhortations, Parangomata. From then on, and for more than a millennium, the Western emperor who wrote in Greek and died on the Danube was remembered only in the Greek East. Areithus, deacon of Patras and then Archbishop of Caesarea, circa AD 850 to 935, writes to a colleague that he owned a tattered copy of the Meditations. Areithus preserved the emperor's fame as a philosopher by having the book copied, not for his correspondent, Demetrius of Heraclea, but for himself. A selfish and wise decision. The Meditations were known and cited by the commentators on Lucian, Marcus's brilliant contemporary, who refers to Marcus as the god after his death. In his marginal comments, we find Areithus engaged in vitriolic observations on his author. Then the Byzantine dictionary, known as the Suda of the late 10th century, contains entries taken from the Meditations. Providentially, a copy of the Meditations reached the West with a flood of learned refugees forced to leave Constantinople by the pressure of the Ottoman Turks. This manuscript seems to have been destroyed after it served as the basis for the first printed edition of the Meditations, Zurich 1559. It was conveyed from Heidelberg to Zurich and the printing firm of Andreas Gessner by a Greek Michael Toxotes. The only nearly full manuscript of the Meditation that survives is that in the Vatican Library. Here in Rome, surviving but diminished in a corrupt manuscript, the emperor who was Pontifex Maximus has returned to his capital. Men of power have naturally identified with the emperor and sought inner strength by withdrawing into the inner citadel of his Meditations. Frederick the Great, Cecil Rhodes, and William Jefferson Clinton, himself a Rhodes Scholar, are three of these. Marcus Aurelius also exerted a powerful spell over two Christian intellectuals of the 19th century, Matthew Arnold and Ernest Renan. Both were powerfully attracted by the deep religious sentiment they detected in the Meditations. Renan's Marcus Aurelius and the End of the Ancient World, Paris 1882, came as the last of the 7 books he wrote on the early history of the Christian Church. At the end of this history, he composed an epitaph for the pagan world and the emperor who died on the 17th of March AD 180. This day, as sorrowful as it was for philosophy and civilization, was a bright day for Christianity. Arnold, who, like Renan, was much absorbed by the Christian martyrs of Marcus's reign, detected an affinity between the persecutor and the Christians he or his magistrates persecuted. In the last glimpse of him that Arnold allows us, we see Marcus at the end of his life, stretching out his arms for something beyond. Tendentem manus ripe ulterioris amore, out of love for the further shore. This is a quotation from Virgil, Aeneid 6:314. But the further shore Arnold had in mind is not the shore across the infernal river of Acheron, but the shore of the light of Christianity. It is appropriate that since the restorations effected by the architect Domenico Fontana in 1589, the Apostle Paul should stand on the summit of the Aurelian Column in Rome, replacing Marcus and his wife Faustina. Marcus has been of compelling interest to writers too. Antony, the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, cites, in Greek, Marcus's own reflections on the moral effect of comedy in his advice to an author in Characteristics of Men, Manners, Opinion, Times, published in 1732. He calls him one of the most wisest and most serious of ancient authors. Goethe mentions him in his correspondence. Walter Pater involves him prominently in his Marius the Epicurean, 1882, as Marius serves as secretary to the Stoic emperor, and Marguerite Yourcenar makes him the addressee of the letter that develops into her Memoirs of Hadrian, 1951. As for others who read the Meditations in times of war, and especially the young men who fought World War I, we have no census of how many retreated into Marcus's inner citadel in the trenches. There were surely some, and it is perhaps to them that Marcus spoke most movingly, as he addressed himself on the campaign on the northern frontiers of the empire, and withdrew into his inner fortress. Disc in Clay, 2006. Meditations, Book 1. From my grandfather Verus, decency and a mild temper. From what they say, and I remember, of my natural father, integrity and manliness. From my mother, piety, generosity, the avoidance of wrongdoing, and even the thought of it. Also simplicity of living, well clear of the habits of the rich. From my great-grandfather, not to have attended schools for the public, to have had good teachers at home, and to realize that this is the sort of thing on which one should spend lavishly. From my tutor, not to become a green or blue supporter of the races, or side with the lights or heavies in the amphitheatre. To tolerate pain and feel few needs. To work with my own hands and mind my own business. To be deaf to malicious gossip. From Diognetus, to avoid empty enthusiasms, to disbelieve all that is taught by miracle mongers and quacks about incantations, exorcism of demons and the like, not to hold quail fights or be excited by such sports, to tolerate plain speaking, to have an affinity for philosophy, and to attend the lectures first of Bacchaeus, then of Tandasis and Marcianus, to write essays from a young age, to love the camp bed, the hide blanket, and all else involved in the Greek training. From Rusticus, to grasp the idea of wanting correction and treatment for my character, not to be diverted into a taste for rhetoric, so not writing up my own speculations, delivering my own little moral sermons, or presenting a glorified picture of the ascetic or the philanthropist, to keep clear of speechifying, versifying, and pretentious language, not to walk around at home in ceremonial dress, or do anything else like that, to write letters in an unaffected style, like his own letter written to my mother from Sinuessa, to be readily recalled to conciliation with those who have taken or given offence, just as soon as they themselves are willing to turn back, to read carefully, not satisfied with my own superficial thoughts, or quick to accept the facile views of others, to have encountered the discourses of Epictetus, to which he introduced me with his own copy. From Apollonius, moral freedom, the certainty to ignore the dice of fortune, and have no other perspective, even for a moment, than that of reason alone. To be always the same man, unchanged in sudden pain, in the loss of a child, in lingering sickness. To see clearly in his living example that a man can combine intensity and relaxation. Not to be impatient in explanation. The observance of a man who clearly regarded as the least of his gifts his experience and skill in communicating his philosophical insights. The lesson of how to take apparent favours from one's friends, neither compromised by them nor insensitive in their rejection. From Sextus, kindly disposition, and the pattern of a household governed by the paterfamilias, the concept of life lived according to nature, an unaffected dignity, intuitive concern for his friends, tolerance both of ordinary people and of the emptily opinionated, an agreeable manner withal, so that the pleasure of his conversation was greater than any flattery, and his very presence brought him the highest respect from all the company. Certainty of grasp and method in the discovery and organization of the essential principles of life. Never to give the impression of anger or any other passion, but to combine complete freedom from passion with the greatest human affection. To praise without fanfare, and to wear great learning lightly. From Alexander, the grammarian, not to leap on mistakes, or captiously interrupt when anyone makes an error of vocabulary, syntax, or pronunciation, but neatly to introduce the correct form of that particular expression by way of answer, confirmation, or discussion of the matter itself, rather than its phrasing, or by some other such felicitous prompting. From Fronto, to understand the effect of suspicion, caprice, and hypocrisy in the exercise of absolute rule, and that for the most part these people we call patricians are somewhat short of human affection. From Alexander the Platonist, rarely, and never without essential cause, to say or write to anyone that I am too busy, nor to use a similar excuse advancing pressure of circumstances, in constant avoidance of the proprieties inherent in our relations to our fellows and contemporaries. From Catullus, not to spurn a friend's criticism, even if it may be an unreasonable complaint, but to try to restore his usual feelings, to speak of one's teachers with whole-hearted gratitude, as is recorded of Domitius and Athenodotus, and a genuine love for children. From Severus, love of family, love of truth, love of justice, to have come by his help to understand Thrasea, Helvidius, Cato, Dio, Brutus, to have conceived the idea of a balanced constitution, a commonwealth based on equality and freedom of speech, and of a monarchy which values above all the liberty of the subject. From him, too, a constant and vigorous respect for philosophy, beneficence, unstinting generosity, optimism. His confidence in the affection of his friends, his frankness with those who met with his censure, and open likes and dislikes, so that his friends did not need to guess at his wishes. From Maximus, self-mastery, immune to any passing whim, good cheer in all circumstances, including illness, a nice balance of character, both gentle and dignified, an uncomplaining energy for what needs to be done, the trust he inspired in everyone that he meant what he said and was well-intentioned in all that he did. Proof against surprise or panic, in nothing either hurried or hesitant, never short of resource, never downcast or cringing, or, on the other hand, angry or suspicious. Generosity in good works, and a forgiving and truthful nature. The impression he gave of undeviating rectitude as a path chosen rather than enforced. The fact that no one would ever have thought himself belittled by him, or presumed to consider himself superior to him, and a pleasant humour. From my adoptive father, gentleness, and an immovable adherence to decisions made after full consideration. No vain taste for so-called honours, stamina and perseverance, a ready ear for anyone with any proposal for the common good, to reward impartially, giving everyone their due, experience of where to tighten, where to relax, a a common courtesy excusing his court from constant attendance at dinner with him and the obligation to accompany him out of town, and those kept away by some other commitment always found him no different towards them. Focused and persistent in deliberation in council, never satisfied with first impressions, and leaving a question prematurely. The concern to keep his friends with no extremes of surfeit or favoritism, his own master in all things, and serene with it, foresight for the longer issues and unfussy control of the least detail. The check he put in his reign on acclamations and all forms of flattery. His constant watch on the needs of the empire, his stewardship of its resources, and his tolerance of some people's criticism in this area. No superstitious fear of the gods, nor with men any populism or obsequious courting of the mob, but a sober steadfastness in all things, and nowhere any vulgar or newfangled taste. In those things which conduce to the comfort of life, and here fortune gave him plenty, to enjoy them without pride or apology either, so no routine acceptance of their presence or regret in their absence. The fact that no one would ever describe him as a fraud or an impostor or a pedant, but rather as a man of mellow wisdom and mature experience beyond flattery, able to take charge of his own and others' affairs.